Hello, my name is Jerome Payne and I'm the Regulation Exams Manager of Fitch Learning. In this recording, we're going to take a look at national cultural characteristics and the effect that this has on organisational culture and the way in which managers and their subordinates react to one another. Back in the 1980s, Geert Hofstede did some research into different national cultural characteristics. Hofstede did some research on over 70 different offices of IBM, the computing company, all over the world. And Hofstede assumed that IBM's corporate culture was constant across those offices. Therefore, when he was observing differences in the way in which managers and their staff interacted with each other in these different offices, Hofstede was able to put these down to national cultural characteristics. Hofstede identified 4 different dimensions in which national cultural characteristics seem to differ. These different cultural characteristics are summarised as being power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism or collectivism, and masculinity or femininity. And if you're a manager managing a cross-functional team, perhaps different nationalities of team members in your team, or if you're a manager managing across national boundaries for a multinational organisation, or perhaps if you're a project manager and you've got project team members of different nationalities, it's really important that you consider both your own national cultural characteristics and those of the team or subordinates that you are attempting to manage. If there are any significant differences, then that could cause you to have to perhaps change your style or think about different ways in which people respond to one another. And this has implications for all different aspects of management, whether it be motivating your staff, whether it be conflict resolution, whether it be drafting human resource policies, whether it be understanding reports or understanding reactions of your subordinates to some of the instructions which you send out. So let's take a look at these 4 different dimensions in more detail. The first dimension in which national cultural characteristics seems to differ is that of power distance. In cultures of high power distance, the less powerful members of that culture accept an unequal power distribution between themselves and the more powerful members of that society. In terms of organisational culture, we can translate this as saying that subordinates expect their managers to take quite autocratic decisions. They would expect managers to issue commands and instructions, and they would not expect their managers to have to justify their decisions or to sell their commands to their subordinates. And managers would work in a similar way. In these organisations, it would be quite common to have quite tall organisational structures, with lots of levels of management and lots of control exerted by managers over their subordinates. A high degree of centralisation would take place in this type of organisation. Subordinates would expect to have little influence over management decision-making, and they would be quite comfortable with this. If a manager in a high power distance culture started expecting subordinates to get involved in decision-making, that might make the subordinates quite uncomfortable. They wouldn't expect this to happen. Typical examples of countries with high power distance include Latin American countries, Russia, India, and the Philippines. By contrast, countries with low power distance are those in which less powerful members of society reject unequal power distribution. They would expect, in other words, power distribution to be much more even across that type of society. They would expect any power differences to be masked or to be hidden in ways in which subordinates and their managers interact with each other. In terms of organisations, we would expect managers and subordinates perhaps to be on first-name terms in this type of organisation. They would expect to treat one another more as equals. A high degree of delegation would be expected by subordinates in this type of organisation. They would expect to be involved in management decision-making, and they would also expect managers to justify or sell their decisions to them. In this type of organisation then, managers would expect more teamwork and more involvement from their subordinates. They would expect a much flatter management structure with greater degrees of decentralisation. Typical countries embodying low power distance include Western European countries, Australia, Canada, and Scandinavian nations. The second dimension in which Hofstede argued national cultural characteristics exist is that of uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance is all to do with people's reactions to risk, to uncertainty, to being put on the spot or to having to make decisions on the hoof, so to speak. In terms of high uncertainty avoidance, people in this type of society would resent or reject uncertainty. There's a stronger preference for control, for certainty, for rules, for rituals. In this type of organisation, you would expect lots and lots of detailed written rules, detailed written regulations, policies, procedural documentation. All of this would be quite explicit and highly detailed. Subordinates would expect managers to give them lots and lots of detailed rules to follow. Risk, dissent, these are not welcome in a high uncertainty avoidance type organisation. Typical countries embodying high uncertainty avoidance would include Greece, Belgium, Japan, and Latin American nations. By contrast, low uncertainty avoidance organisations are those in which risk and uncertainty are welcomed. They are seen as sources of creativity. Indeed, being flexible towards changing situations is seen as being a positive thing in this type of organisation. For that reason, there are very few strict written rules and procedures. They tend to concentrate on the most important areas, or perhaps the most legally risky areas in those organisations. Indeed, risk is seen as a positive thing in a low uncertainty avoidance organisation. It's seen as a source of creativity, flexibility, and innovation for the future. A typical low uncertainty avoidance set of countries would include Singapore, the United States of America, China, and India. According to Hofstede, the third dimension in which national cultures seem to differ is that to do with individualism and collectivism. In highly individualistic cultures, it's the I that comes first, as in me. In these types of cultures, people expect to stand on their own 2 feet. They expect to look after themselves and perhaps their immediate family, and they expect other people to think in similar ways. People in an individualistic culture would expect to make their own decisions and to stand or fall as a result. In this type of organisation, people very much take the attitude, I'll look after myself and I'll expect you to look after yourself. In organisations which are highly individualistic, autonomy and individual responsibility are highly valued. Indeed, the organisation is seen as impersonal. It's seen as quite an impartial person in that type of organisation or national cultural characteristic. And task achievement is seen as most important, far more important than, for example, relationship building. Individualistic countries include the United States, the Netherlands, Australia, and the United Kingdom. By contrast, in collectivist societies, the we comes first. Indeed, society is seen as very positive, and social networks and social reliance upon one another is expected and valued in that type of society. It's very much the norm that we all look after each other. In a collectivist organisation, interdependence and social acceptability is most highly valued. The organisation is seen more as a family, which looked after its workers and managers, and a family in which we all look out for one another. In this type of organisation, relationship improvement and relationship building is seen as more important than pure task achievement. Countries with highly collectivistic characteristics include Mexico, Africa, India, and Saudi Arabia. The final dimension, according to Hofstede, in which national cultural characteristics differ, is that of masculinity versus femininity. This is all to do with gender roles and gender stereotypes. In a highly masculine culture, there are clearly differentiated gender roles, and men and women are usually seen to stick to those gender roles. So to give you an example, physical jobs such as bricklaying or labouring, or perhaps jobs such as being a van driver, something like that, would be seen as quite a male role. You would expect men to carry out those jobs. By contrast, more caring jobs, such as nursing or childcare, for example, would be seen as a woman's job. And it would be highly unusual to see men or women stepping outside of those gender roles. In organisations in a highly masculine culture, then macho values and characteristics such as assertiveness, competitiveness, gathering material wealth, short-term objective hitting, these type of masculine stereotypical values are seen to be most important. Countries with a high masculinity characteristic include Japan, Mexico, Italy, and Australia. By contrast, in more feminine cultures, gender roles are minimized or indeed are non-existent. There are no strict ideas or expectations as to what sort of role or job it is that a man would do or that a woman would do. So in these type of cultures, a female bricklayer or a female labourer, or perhaps a male nurse or a male childcare assistant would be seen as being much less unusual than it would be in a masculine culture, and also much less remarkable. Men and women are much freer in those types of societies to choose what kind of career path they would like to carry out. In terms of organisations in feminine cultures, then relationships and consensus building and quality of life would be valued far more highly than the typical masculine or macho cultural characteristics that we discussed earlier on. And indeed, in a feminine culture, both men and women would see that as being positive. Feminine values would be valued by everybody in society, both male and female. Typical countries with feminine characteristics would include Sweden, Thailand, some Middle Eastern countries, and Spain. So we've taken a look at the 4 different dimensions in which Hofstede argues that national cultures are different. It's really important if you're a manager with team members or subordinates of a different nationality, or if you're a manager working in a country outside of that in which you were brought up or outside of that in which you grew up. It's really important that you consider these different national characteristics and consider the effect that they can have on the way that you motivate your team members, on the way in which you communicate with them, and the way in which you exert control over others.